Chapter 1. Rivers End Ranch, Weston, Idaho, 1892. Frankie Weston leaned back, rocking the old wooden chair on its back legs. I've decided I need to get married. I'm sick of doing double work around here. We need help. Frankie's brother, Willard, frowned. What do you mean? How are you going to make that work? Frankie shrugged. Same way anyone else does, I guess. Hard work, patience, and a whole lot of praying. But, how do you think you're going to find someone? It's not like you can go to a barn dance or an ice cream social to find a mate. Haven't you ever heard of mail-order brides? Frankie asked. I found a little matchmaker that sends out brides to men in need. But, how's that going to help? Willard asked, obviously perplexed. Frankie leaned forward, palms on the table. I'm going to ask for a mail-order groom. Why not? It's possible, right? Willard sighed, shaking his head. You've lost it, Frankie. By the way, we got a letter from Ma when I rode to town today. She said you need to wear a skirt. Frankie wrinkled her nose. How can I do a man's work if I'm wearing a skirt? That's why I need a husband. I'm ready to wear skirts again, but you can't do all the ranch chores by yourself. Not with 2 homesteads. I guess. The siblings had decided to move west from New York together, and Francine had become Frankie. Her real name was on the documents, of course, but she hadn't wanted to draw undue attention to herself, so she'd started dressing as a man and answering to a man's name. Thankfully, the nickname had been one she'd had as a child, and she was used to it. After 3 years of doing a man's job, she was ready to stay in the house all day and cook and clean. Women's work sounded downright glorious. Especially since she'd been doing women's work and men's work. Frankie shrugged. I'm going to write a letter tonight, and I need you to take it to town in the morning. If Providence is on our side, I'll have a husband before winter. Are you going to ask for someone who doesn't mind a woman who wears breeches most of the time? She nodded. Definitely. Of course, once he gets here, I'll be able to wear skirts again. I'm also going to ask for a man who is willing to change his last name to Weston. I know it's strange, but I like the whole spread being one ranch, and I want my kids being raised with the Weston name. Willard laughed, shaking his head at his sister. You're never going to find a man willing to give up his name. Have you lost your ever-loving mind? I admit it won't be easy. Why, it'll take a mail-order miracle. You write your letter, and I'll send it. I'll write it while you do the dishes, Frankie insisted. I've done them every night this week after spending every day mending fences with you. It's your turn. Willard grumbled, but he got to his feet and cleared the table. Frankie got up and got some paper and a pencil, quickly scrawling out a letter. Once she was done, she read over it. It's not going to get any better than that. Willard just shook his head. Asterisk. Beckham, Massachusetts. Wallace Miller swiped his hand over his head, wiping away the sweat. It was an unusually balmy October in Beckham, Massachusetts. He was working for the mercantile in town doing deliveries, and he was daydreaming about going west. He was always daydreaming about going west. He loved the idea of disappearing and changing his identity. He'd been a member of the demon horde as a child, and no one wanted to give him work. No man wanted to let Wally court his daughter. It was enough to make a man just take off and tell no one where he was going. Of course, to do that, he'd need to have enough money saved up to make it work. And where would he go? He was working for the mercantile on a trial basis. He saved every dime he made, but it never seemed to be enough. He unhitched the horses and took them to the livery, glad his shift was over. As he handed over the horses and left to walk home to the farm where he lived with his parents and 3,000 siblings, there were really only 10 still at home, he saw his older sister's butler. He shook his head. Even after 6 years, he couldn't get used to Elizabeth having a butler. Wallace, your sister would like to see you. Wally raised an eyebrow. He wanted to make a snide remark about Her Highness, but he wouldn't. Bernard the butler was actually kind of scary. He was the kind of man that seemed nice and kind, but could kill you with one hand tied behind his back. Wally wasn't sure why he thought that about him, but he did. He nodded. Sure. I'll head on over. Bernard fell into step beside Wally. I'll drive you home when you're finished. I can walk. What does Lizard Breath want with me anyway? When the old nickname slipped out, he bit his lip, wondering if the butler would be angry with him. Miss Miller didn't tell me. Wally thought he saw the corner of the older man's mouth quirk, but he couldn't be sure. Stodgy old goat. I'm sure it's something of global importance. When the butler didn't respond, Wally remained silent for the rest of the short walk. He didn't want to get onto Bernard's bad side anyway. He was led down the hallway to the room at the very end of the hall on the left, and he saw his sister sitting quietly at a desk, her hand poised as she wrote a note to someone. Hey, sis. Elizabeth put down her pencil and hurried to Wally, hugging him tightly. Thanks for coming. I have a proposition for you. Won't you sit down? As Wally sat on the sofa, she asked Bernard for tea and cookies to be served. Do you need something more substantial than cookies? He nodded. I'd love something more substantial than cookies. Elizabeth rolled her eyes. We'll have one extra for dinner tonight, Bernard. Wally grinned as Bernard nodded and slipped away. The food was much better at Elizabeth's house than it was at his parents' house. She had a cook and money. Their parents barely scraped by. He was going to take advantage while he could. What's going on, Lizard? The old nickname popped out before he could think about it, and she grinned in response. I received a letter today that I think might interest you. He frowned. Elizabeth was a mail-order bride broker. She matched up lonely women in Beckham to lonely men in the West. Why would he be interested in one of her letters? Really? She sorted through a stack of letters on her desk and handed him one, watching him as he read it. Dear proprietor of the Beckham Mail Order Bride Organization. This letter will probably seem odd to you, but I do hope you'll be able to help me. Let me tell you a bit about myself. I'm a 20-year-old woman who moved to Idaho with my brother 3 years ago. I will confess that I lied about my age so that I could have my own homestead. When I moved here, I was well aware that the unmarried women of the area would be far outnumbered by the bachelors, so I chose to disguise myself as a man. I had my brother start calling me Frankie instead of Francine, and I wore breeches instead of skirts. I've been doing a man's work for far too long, and I'm ready to marry, but I don't think any of the men in the area will have me after thinking of me as a man for so long. Here's where you enter the picture. I would like you to send me a mail-order groom. I don't even know if such a thing exists, but if not, it should for women like me. I would like a man between the ages of 21 and 35. I would like his name to start with a W, or that he be willing to change his name to one that starts with a W, as all men in my family have W names. The most important part of my request comes next. I would like him to forego his surname and take on my last name, which is Weston. I want my children and their children to inherit the land that I plowed with my own hands, but I want them to have the Weston name. I realize what I'm asking for is a very tall order, and I will certainly understand if it can't be done. Please forward any correspondence of candidates to me here at River's End Ranch in Weston, Idaho. My brother and I will gladly pay the way for a man to ride the train west to join us here. I look forward to hearing your response. Francine, Frankie, Weston. Wally blinked a few times, finally looking up and meeting Elizabeth's gaze. Her green eyes were very like his own, but his hair was darker, a medium brown instead of blonde like hers. I don't know what to say. Elizabeth smiled. I knew you'd be startled, but I think you'd make a good candidate. There you'd be starting anew. No one would know about the demon horde. You'd have a place of your own to share with a woman. I would bet she's tall and masculine to have been able to pull off being a man for so long, but you're a tall man. I don't know if that would matter to you. But, give up my name? How could I do that? Only your last name. Women do it when they marry, and I see nothing wrong with a man doing it for a woman. Especially a woman who is willing to help him make his dream of having a cattle ranch in the West come true. Think about it, Wally. They've named the ranch River's End. Doesn't that sound like a beautiful place to live? It does. My head is reeling. When do I need to have an answer by? Elizabeth shrugged. You know as much as I do. I'll give you a week to make a decision before I start looking for another groom for her. That should give you sufficient time to make up your mind. Don't you think? I guess so. He leaned back on the sofa, the letter still clutched in his hand. Frankie. Could he marry a woman named Frankie? He didn't know. He thought about Alice Weist, the girl who lived on the next farm over from his parents. He'd asked her father if he could court her, and the man had laughed in his face. He'd been finished with school for 4 years and had just recently found someone who would give him a chance at working, but he was constantly watched. He'd never dreamed his childhood pranks would be so hard to live down as an adult. You don't have to make a decision now, Wally, Elizabeth said gently, her face as sweet as ever. I think I already have. I'm going to do it. As soon as he'd said the words, he knew they were the right answer. And I'm not doing this writing back and forth thing. I have a little money. I'm going to take the next train to Idaho. She blinked at him a couple of times before throwing her head back to laugh. You never did anything the easy way. Do you have proper clothes? Are you sure you have enough money? He shrugged. I don't know what a train ticket to Idaho costs, but I'm going to find out. He jumped to his feet, pacing back and forth. Do you think this man-woman will start wearing skirts when I get there? Or will she keep wearing breeches? I don't want anyone to think I'm married to a man. Elizabeth grinned. I think she's ready to admit she's a woman or she wouldn't be looking for a husband. And I wouldn't start thinking of her as a man-woman, or that's going to come out of your mouth once you're together, and she's going to put you on a train right back to Massachusetts. Do you think Ma and Pa will be mad if I do this? No, I don't. They didn't have a problem with Susan becoming a mail-order bride, and she was a woman. They won't worry as much about you. He nodded. That's true. And they were fine with Charlie staying in Montana when she went out there as a traveling companion. I guess we'll find out, though, won't we? We will. After dinner, Bernard drove him home, and he said little. He was so busy thinking about his future that he couldn't even find the energy to annoy the serious man. When they got to the farm, he jumped down. Thanks for the ride. He hurried into the house and found his parents together in the parlor, ignoring the massive amounts of chaos around them. The older girls took care of the younger children, which had always been the way in their home. There was writing on the walls and dirt on the floors. His mother tried to keep up, but she refused to discipline her children, which made the whole effort pointless. His mother looked up from her mending when he entered the room. You weren't here for supper. I ate with Elizabeth in town. His mom frowned at him. With Elizabeth? I didn't know you were going to see her. She sent for me today. She got a letter from a woman wanting a mail-order groom, and I'm going to do it. I'm going to Idaho to marry a stranger. His father grinned at him. You've been wanting to go west. Do it, son. Wally smiled. I plan on it. And I'm not waiting for her to send me a train ticket either. I've saved my wages from the past couple of weeks, and I'm going to take off as soon as I can get a ticket. Does she even know you're coming? His mother asked with a frown. He shook his head. Nope. She'll be surprised, won't she? I'm going upstairs to pack. Hopefully you'll be able to move Mikey up to my bed tomorrow night. Mikey was the second youngest of the Miller children his mother kept popping out. He thought she may be done, because it had been a couple of years since Rebecca was born, and she didn't seem to be pregnant yet. His mother shrugged. It would be nice to be down to only one baby in our room. Make sure you write and tell us that you made it safe. I don't trust those trains. They go too fast. Having received all the blessings he knew he would from his parents, he hurried up the stairs to throw all of his belongings into a carpet bag. He didn't have much, but he didn't need much. He was going to Idaho to marry a stranger who wasn't even expecting him. From drudgery to excitement in one day. He couldn't wait to be on that train. Chapter 2. Wally was on the train shortly after noon the following day. The mercantile owner hadn't been terribly upset or surprised. He hadn't expected to have a long-time worker who had been a member of the demon horde. His reaction made Wally realize he'd made the right decision. He needed to be with people who had no preconceived notions of who he was or what he was about. The train trip would be long and tedious, and he'd have 2 hours in a stagecoach once he'd arrived. Of course, after that, there was no telling how long it would take to find River's End Ranch. Hopefully the people in town would know it. He had never been on a train and watched excitedly as they pulled out of the station. He'd never even been as far away as Boston. Even if things didn't work out with Frankie, he'd have the adventure of a lifetime. Asterisk. Frankie wiped the sweat from her forehead. The house was hot. She was canning pickles today. It was one of her least favorite tasks, but it needed to be done, so she'd do it. Willard was on the ranch, cutting firewood for the long winter they knew would hit any day. It was early November, and they hadn't had a good, hard snowfall yet, but it would be coming any day, she was sure. As she was setting the jars on the counter to cool, she heard a knock on the door. Wiping her hands on a towel, she grabbed a hat from a hook and tucked her long braid under it. She'd taken to working in breeches even in the house, but she did have to hide her waist-length blonde hair if anyone came along. She picked up a pistol from the work table where she kept one loaded and ready, tucking it into the waistband at the base of her spine. She opened the door wide and found herself staring at a handsome stranger. "May I help you?" she asked in her gruffest voice. She rarely left the ranch because she didn't want to be found out, but when someone came along, she was made sure she was always ready to deal with them. Sometimes neighbors needed help, but this was no neighbor. "Yes, I'm looking for Frankie Weston." The man had a carpet bag beside him and looked rumpled, almost as if it had been several days since he'd slept. "Why is someone looking for me?" "I'm Frankie." As she looked at him, she wished she was wearing a fancy dress and elbow-length gloves, ready to dance the night away, instead of wearing breeches, an old apron, and a worn work shirt, with her breasts bound beneath it. He looked at her for a moment as if he could see right through her disguise to the woman within. She gave a slight shudder, hoping she was wrong, while also hoping she was right. She was so confused. She wanted her disguise to be good enough no one would see through, but she also wanted him to see her as a woman. "I'm Wallace Miller. I'm your mail-order groom." Frankie wasn't often struck dumb, but at that moment, she wasn't sure she'd ever find words again. I thought I'd receive a letter before you left Massachusetts." What was he doing here? She'd meant to greet her future husband properly, in a dress. Wallace shrugged. "May I come in?" "I don't know." He sighed. "I'm dead tired. If it makes you feel better, leave the door wide open." "Get a gun." "I don't care. I just need to sit for a bit." He understood that she may be worried about allowing a stranger into her home, but he needed to sit down somewhere. He'd gotten a ride to about a mile from their home, and then he'd had to walk from there. He didn't mind long walks, but his body was so tired from the train ride. He felt like he could still feel the thing rumbling beneath him. Frankie looked at the clock on the fireplace mantel and knew that Willard would be there within a few minutes. She'd leave the door open and cool off in the process. What could it hurt? She opened the door wide for him to enter. "My brother will be here in just a few minutes." Wally nodded, walking into the house and collapsing into one of the chairs at her table. "Usually you would have received a letter before I left home, but I didn't want to wait that long. I'm ready to start a new life in the West, and I'm here to do that. Just as soon as I sleep for a day or two." He hid a yawn behind his huge hand. "I wish I'd known." She stood awkwardly for a moment before she returned to work. He'd been rude enough to show up unannounced so she could continue to work in front of him. She had no choice anyway. "I'm just making a simple supper tonight. I've been canning all day and haven't had time to prepare anything. I don't mind simple meals." He watched her as she lifted a door in the floor and descended into the cellar, coming back up a minute later with potatoes held in her apron. He couldn't help but wonder how anyone could mistake her for a man with mannerisms like that. A man would have looked for a bucket to carry potatoes. A woman carried them in an apron. "Tell me about yourself," she said, washing the potatoes with water she pumped in. She efficiently peeled them and cut them into small pieces for frying. As he watched her, he saw definite advantages to women wearing pants. He could see her bottom outlined very well. She didn't look a bit like a man to him. "I was raised in a family of 15 children. We were referred to as the demon horde because we spent all of our time playing tricks on people. Teachers never lasted more than a month or two because we'd scare them all away." He wasn't sure why he was telling her this. Hadn't he moved to Idaho to avoid the reputation he'd created for himself back east? "My dream has always been to come out west to ranch, but I didn't think I'd ever be able to save enough. Not many people in town wanted to hire me because of my reputation." Frankie nodded. She could see their concerns. The words demon horde didn't make her want to marry him either. "I see. My older sister, Elizabeth, runs the mail-order bride agency you wrote to. When she saw your letter, she immediately thought of me. I was supposed to write you back and go through all the regular channels, but I was in a hurry. I'm sorry if I put you out by my unexpected arrival." She considered telling him it was fine, but that would have been a lie. "I'm sure my brother will be happy to have someone here to help him so quickly. I try hard with the ranch chores, but I'm just not strong enough for some things." She cut off several pieces of bacon and put them on to fry. "How'd you find us? You said in your letter you were near Weston, Idaho. I took a train, and then a stagecoach, and a nice man gave me a ride from town." "Did you tell him you were here to marry me?" she asked, alarm in her face. He shook his head. "No, that's your secret. I told him I came here to work, which is the truth, just not all of it." She dried her hands on a towel and turned to look at him. "Since you came unannounced, and I really had no time to prepare myself, how would you feel about staying with my brother for a week or two, and we can get to know each other before we decide if we really want to marry or not?" He shrugged. "I can deal with that. Is there room?" She blushed. "There's not room here. You'll stay with my brother." "Oh, I guess I just assumed you lived together." "We would, but part of the rules of homesteading is we have to build up each of the plots of land, so he has a cabin, and I have a proper house. He doesn't even have a kitchen, because we eat all meals here." "Will he mind?" Frankie shrugged. "He's pretty affable. I don't think he'll mind at all." There was a stomping outside the door and Willard stepped into the room, looking around. "Who are you?" By the look on his face, it was clear that he wasn't used to coming in from work to find his sister with a man. Wally got to his feet. Wallace Miller. I came from Massachusetts to marry your sister. Willard grinned. I guess we got our mail order miracle, huh, Frankie? Frankie wrinkled her nose at him, and Wally stared. How could anyone believe she was a man? She was a petite little thing. I guess so. He's going to stay with you for a couple of weeks while we decide if we'll suit. I'm not sure that's how it's supposed to work. Aren't you supposed to marry him as soon as he gets here? Willard asked, removing his hat and scratching his head. Frankie shrugged. That's how it would have worked if I'd known he was coming. I'm not prepared to marry yet. I need to make myself a dress. Her old dresses were much too small. She hadn't really gained weight since moving to Idaho, but she'd gained a great deal of muscles, which made the dresses very snug. Wally sighed. I was worried you'd keep wearing breeches after we married and people would think I was married to a man. He was very relieved to find out that wasn't her plan. She blushed, turning away. Not at all. I just have to figure out how I'm going to admit that I'm really a woman. She realized then she was still wearing her cowboy hat, and she plucked it off her head and hung it on the hook on the wall, her long braid falling out and hanging down her back. Wally stared at her. Your hair is pretty. What a way with words the man had. She wasn't sure he was the man she'd waited her whole life for by any means. Wash up. I'll have supper on the table in a minute. Both men washed up, and Wally took the chair Willard indicated. Frankie served them both generous helpings of eggs, bacon, and fried potatoes. Coffee or milk? She asked. Coffee if you have it, Wally responded immediately. He wouldn't be able to stay awake through supper without a little coffee in his system. It had been a very long journey. Frankie poured coffee for him and for her brother, but she poured a glass of milk for herself. She took her place at the table, and bowed her head while Willard prayed for them. Wally took one bite of her cooking and sighed contentedly. You're a good cook, he said, surprise in his voice. Why do you sound so shocked? Frankie asked. Did he think she knew nothing of being a woman because she pretended to be a man? I guess I thought that you liked acting like a man so much that you never really learned to be a woman. She sighed. I was raised in upstate New York. My mother taught me to be a proper young lady. I didn't even tell her I was running around in pants, but Big Brother here couldn't keep his mouth shut. So now Mother knows, and she's not exactly pleased with me. Every time she sends a letter, she tells me to put on a skirt, which I will happily do as soon as I'm ready to get married. So why pretend to be a man at all? She shrugged. I never planned to. I had a couple of pairs of pants with me, which I knew I'd need to wear to do some of the hard work here, but when we were in that town getting ready to go to the survey office to choose our claims, it was a loud, rough crowd there. I had 4 men proposition me in the space of 10 minutes when we first got to town, and I thought I'd be safer pretending to be a man. And I have been. She'd missed female companionship, though. It was hard to be a man all the time. Only her brother knew the truth, and now this man. Willard looked at Wally. Have you ever worked on a ranch? Wally shook his head. Nope. I grew up on a farm, and I've spent a lot of time working for my pa since I finished school, so I know farm chores, and ranch chores can't be that much different. Willard shrugged. I guess we'll see. You plan on working with me tomorrow? Wally thought about how tired he was and how good it would feel to sleep late the following morning, but he nodded his head. I'm up for work whenever I'm needed. Good. We get up at 5 in the morning. If Frankie can stay in and cook and clean and act like a girl most of the time, she'll be pretty darn happy. I'll have breakfast ready at 5:30. She loved the idea of not having to go out and use her muscles. Maybe she could get some sewing done the next day. She wasn't sure she wanted to marry Wally, but she knew she wanted to marry someone. Maybe it would be him. Wally nodded. I'm going to have to head to bed right after supper then, I'm afraid. I'm pretty tired from all that traveling. Frankie nodded. Do you want me to heat some water for a bath before you head over to Willard's place? I'm too tired to take a bath. I'd drown. He knew he smelled bad, but he just needed sleep more than he needed to be clean. He'd bathe tomorrow. After supper, Willard stood. I'll take care of the dishes tonight. You walk Wallace to my house and make up a bed for him. Frankie nodded. There were 2 beds in Willard's cabin, because they took on a ranch hand from time to time. There was simply too much work for 2 people. She'd still be helping on the ranch on occasion, but at least she could stay inside the majority of the time. She took one of the lanterns from the wall and held it up for him, and he noticed that the sun had set. Now, when had that happened? He followed her down the steps and outside, breathing deeply of the fresh air. This is a beautiful piece of land, Miss Weston. Please, call me Francine. Francine? Is that what you go by? She shrugged. I did when I was back east. Willard has gotten into the bad habit of calling me Frankie, but I still think of myself as Francine most of the time. I go by Wally, he told her. Wally? That suits you better than Wallace. Oh? Why is that? Wallace seems like an old man with a pipe. You're too young to be a Wallace. You're too pretty to be a Frankie, he countered, watching as she stumbled at his words. You can't call me pretty. I know that I don't look like a woman in these old clothes. As she said it, she realized she wanted him to see her in a dress. She wanted him to know there was so much more to her than what he saw before him. She'd be sewing like crazy. I can't believe anyone ever thought you were a man, Francine. I looked at you and knew immediately. Only because you knew to look. No one else has known in the 3 years we've been here. Of course, she didn't exactly go to church every week. She mostly stayed on the ranch. Only when someone came out to help them with something did they see her. I'd have known. I promise you I would. She opened the door to Willard's cabin and hurried over to make up the extra bed. I think you'll be quite comfortable, she said softly. Good night, Wally. Good night, Francine. He watched her leave, a smile on his lips. She was beautiful, and there was nothing masculine about her. Tomorrow, when he didn't smell quite so bad, he'd take her for a walk and try to steal a kiss. Chapter 3. Early the next morning, Frankie was setting a plate of pancakes on the table to join the pile of bacon on another plate, when Wally and Willard came into the house, both of them shedding their coats and hanging them on a hook. It's getting cold out there, Willard told her, rubbing his hands together briskly. Frankie poured all 3 of them some coffee and sat at the table, waiting for them to join her. How did you sleep? She asked Wally. She'd wanted to wait until he spoke to her first, because she felt that was polite, but also he was her house guest, in a way, so she felt like she should be a good hostess. She couldn't figure out which rules of politeness to apply. Like a log. Wally glanced at Willard. I hope I didn't keep you awake with my snores. Willard shook his head. After a hard day of work here at the ranch, I don't think being trampled by my own herd would have woken me up. Good. I didn't want to give my host a sleepless night the first time we slept in the same house. Wally grinned. Does Frankie snore? Willard laughed softly. That's not something an intelligent man would ever answer about the woman who cooks his food. Frankie smiled at Wally, her heart pounding faster as she thought about what he might mean to her. My brother enjoys food that's not burned or poisoned. Wally nodded. He is indeed a smart man, Francine. I know he is. She secretly marveled that he was calling her Francine. Maybe he didn't use her given name often, but he used it often enough that she felt a flutter in her tummy from it. What are you planning on doing today? Whatever your brother tells me to do. Willard ate a bite of his pancakes, looking at Wally. "How are you with a rifle?" Wally shrugged. "I did some rabbit hunting at home and hit my mark most of the time." "Why?" "We have some deer that have been moving in too close on our property. We'll need to take care of them." Willard smiled. "Frankie makes the best venison stew you ever tasted. If we can get one home and hang it from a tree before lunch, I bet she'll make stew for supper." Frankie smiled. "I will. But you'd better hurry." She ate the last of her breakfast and carried her plate to the sink, immediately heating water for the dishes. "Would either of you care for another cup of coffee?" Wally nodded. The truth was he had slept well, but it hadn't been nearly enough. He'd slept very little on the journey from Massachusetts, because the train had been so crowded. Now that he'd reached his destination, he wanted to sleep for a couple of days, but he wasn't about to be thought of as a slacker to the brother and sister. "I'd love another." She carried the pot over and poured him another cup. "We'll heat you up some bathwater after supper." He wrinkled his nose. He knew he smelled badly, but there was little he could do about it. He'd washed earlier before coming over, but he needed a real bath. "That would be nice, as long as it's not too much trouble." Frankie bit back her reply. She'd started to tell him that the trouble was worth lack of agony to her nostrils, but that was something she said to her brother, not her potential husband. How he did working for Willard would go a long way toward whether or not she'd marry him. "I'd be happy to do it." After Wally finished his second cup of coffee, the two men were off. "We'll be here for lunch," Willard called over his shoulder as they left. "Bring me back some venison," she told him, starting to work on the breakfast dishes. As soon as she'd finished that, she scrubbed her kitchen, started a soup for lunch, and mixed up enough dough to make a few loaves of bread, leaving it to rise on the work table. When she'd finally finished all that, she sat down with a length of fabric her brother had gone clear to Post Falls to purchase for her. It was a pretty pink calico with tiny little flowers, and she traced her fingers over it. She loved the idea of having a pretty dress to wear for her wedding. She would probably still have to wear her breeches a lot, because they were easier to work in, but she would have something nice for when she wanted to feel like a lady. She made quick, decisive cuts with her pattern, and then she began sewing. She'd used a sewing machine back in New York, but all her clothes had been purchased since they'd moved to Idaho, so it was slow going at first, but she gradually gained speed. She stopped once to punch down the bread, but sat right back down to work on the dress. Shortly before noon, she heard the men outside. Peeking out the window, she saw them stringing a buck from an old oak tree, and she smiled. Venison stew for supper would be a reality. Quickly hiding the dress she was working on in her bedroom, she popped the loaves of bread into the oven. The men would take a little while to deal with the deer, and she would have lunch ready when they came in. By the time lunch was over, the deer would have bled out enough that they could bring a big enough piece for her to make into stew that evening. She looked forward to some meals with venison. It felt like she used pork for almost everything. She was just sliding the loaves of bread out of the oven when the two men came in. "Wash your hands." They both washed their hands obediently. "Wally shot the buck," Willard informed her. "I'm not sure I could have gotten it from that distance, but he did it with one shot." Frankie smiled at Wally. "Thank you." He felt himself lost in her eyes. Even in breeches, she was the prettiest girl he'd ever met. "My pleasure." He sat down at the table and waited as she put a bowl of soup in front of him. "Do you want coffee? Or water?" She usually served water with lunch, but she'd noticed he seemed to prefer coffee with every meal. "I'll have coffee," Wally told her. "Will we hunt more after lunch?" Willard shook his head. "We'll wait until most of this meat is gone and get another. I'd like to get more of them away from the ranch faster, but I'm not willing to waste the meat." "Have you thought about selling some in town?" Willard shrugged. I guess we could. I hadn't thought about it much. We need to remove a few tree stumps today. I want to clear an area for Frankie to put in a kitchen garden this spring. She's wanted one since we've moved here, but there's been no time with everything else we do. This coming spring, she'll have one. All right, Wally responded. He had no idea what removing stumps entailed, but if Willard was willing to show him, then he was willing to do the job. He would do anything to prove he was worthy to marry the woman who was cooking for them. She set a plate of sliced bread on the table, along with a ball of butter. Then she took her place across from Willard, with Wally sitting at the foot of the table. You making me some venison stew for supper? Willard asked, taking a big bite of the soup in front of him. Of course I am. How could I not make my brother his favorite meal? Wally watched the byplay between them, feeling like an outsider. I can't wait to taste your stew, he said softly. She smiled at him, making his insides flutter. What's your favorite meal, Wally? I'm particularly fond of chicken and dumplings and roast beef. It depends on the day of the week, which is my favorite. Wally spooned up a bite of the potato soup she'd served. This is really good. You always seem so surprised when I cook something well. Frankie shook her head at him. I keep telling you that I was raised properly. It just seems strange that someone wearing pants is a good cook. Plenty of men cook. Frankie knew she was being persnickety, but at the moment she didn't care. He seemed to think that the ability to cook went hand in hand with wearing a skirt, and she didn't like it. I didn't mean to offend you. Wally had never courted a woman, though he'd wanted to. Learning the fine nuances of saying the right thing was going to take him a while, and he knew it. He only hoped the pretty girl beside him would understand that. I was trying to pay you a compliment, but it came out wrong. She sighed. I knew you were being complimentary, and I took it wrong anyway. I'm sorry. She hated to admit she was wrong and apologize, but she tried to do it when it was called for. Willard looked back and forth between his two table companions. You two are already bickering like an old married couple. Might as well tie the knot soon. Frankie glared at her brother. I don't think this discussion concerns you, Willard. Maybe not, but if you're going to argue in front of me, you'll be getting my opinion on the matter. Wally sighed. He hadn't meant to bicker at all. Had she taken a dislike to him? Maybe after he'd bathed and put on the last of his clean-smelling clothes, she'd like him better. It was Saturday. He hoped they'd not work on Sunday, so he could wash his clothes, now that he thought about it. What do we do on Sundays around here? Frankie frowned. I couldn't deal with going to church and pretending to be a man, so Willard and I worship at home. You're welcome to join us or go into town to the church there. I'll worship with you. He didn't have any desire to be away from her. His goal was to get to know her better. Do we work on Sundays? No more than absolutely necessary. I cook, we gather eggs, and milk the cows. I wash up the dishes. Would it be a problem if I washed my laundry tomorrow? He'd never done laundry, of course, because men didn't do that, but he couldn't ask her to wash his clothes until after they were married. Willard brings his dirty clothes over on Monday mornings, and I wash them. Make sure yours are here and I'll get them done. It wouldn't be warm enough to hang the clothes out for much longer without them freezing on the line. She'd need to start hanging them in the basement. Are you sure you don't mind? Wally asked, surprised that she offered so readily. She shook her head. Of course not. It's easy enough for me to wash them when I'm doing ours. Besides, if she was going to marry him, she'd be washing his clothes for a lot of years to come. After the men left, she quickly cut up the venison they brought to her and browned it for stew. She chopped up onions, potatoes, and carrots and added them before washing up the lunch dishes. It wasn't long before she was once again seated in her rocking chair in the corner of the room, sewing as quickly as her fingers would allow. She wanted the dress done soon, so they could go into town to marry. She'd decided she'd have him, if only he'd ask her. She knew it was somewhat of a hasty decision, but when she looked at him, she felt flutters in her tummy and her heart beat faster. Never before had she reacted that way to a man. Yes, she'd marry him. She knew him well enough. Asterisk. Wally wiped the sweat off his brow. So how long do I need to wait to ask Francine if she'll marry me? Willard leaned forward on his shovel. Francine? You going to call her by her real name? I can't ask a man to marry me. Wally hated that people called her Frankie. He hated that people believed she was a man. He wouldn't add to it. I reckon a couple of days is enough. Why, if it were me, I'd probably ask her tonight. You've had 3 of her meals, so you know she can cook. She's watched you eat 3 meals, so she knows you don't talk with your mouth full or throw peas at the supper table. Ask her. Really? I thought she'd want me to wait a month or 2. Willard laughed. Frankie? That woman is the most impetuous girl in the whole nation. No, you ask her tonight, and I guarantee she's already decided what she's going to say. Wally got back to work, thinking about Willard's words. If she'd already made her mind up, there was no reason to wait, was there? Chapter 4. The stew was everything Wally had been led to believe and more. He considered dropping to one knee and proposing right there at the table, but he knew she wouldn't accept a proposal from a man who was as filthy as he was. When supper was over, he helped carry in the bathtub and added the water Frankie had set on the stove to boil before they sat down to eat. The tub had been placed in her bedroom. He felt strange being in her room, even though she wasn't there, because it was private. It was the only room in her house that Willard didn't seem to think he had the right to do whatever he wanted in. As soon as Wally was out of the way, Frankie heated another large pan of water to do the dishes. Keeping her voice low, she asked, "How'd he do today?" Willard tipped his chair back onto 2 legs as he studied his sister. He's a hard worker. Doesn't talk a whole lot, but I think that's in his favor. Frankie nodded once. I can agree with that. I think I'm going to marry him if he asks. I figured you were leaning in that direction. Your venison stew has never been better. If I spend some time sewing my dress tomorrow, I can have it ready to wear by Tuesday afternoon. Would that be too soon to marry? Do you think? I don't think so. Are you sure that's what you want? Frankie couldn't mention the flutters in her belly when she looked at Wally. Not with her brother. If he's a good worker, then that's what we need around here. Willard studied her before finally nodded. I just want you to be happy. You know I wouldn't do anything that would make me unhappy. I'm not that self-sacrificing. You should probably suggest a walk after his bath then. Spend a little time alone with him. Frankie nodded. She could do that. It even made sense. You wouldn't mind? He shook his head. I think we'll both have to get used to the idea we won't spend nearly as much time together if you're married. You'll be off doing married stuff, and I'll still be in my lonely bachelor cabin. She frowned. You'll still take meals with us. I won't have you trying to figure out how to cook over a fire in that tiny cabin of yours. Willard nodded. I think I'll need to. Besides, we're partners, not just siblings. Rivers End Ranch belongs to both of us. Wally emerged then in clean clothes, his hair freshly combed. He felt funny, knowing he looked much better than he had since he'd met Frankie. Would you care to walk with me, Francine? Frankie nodded, walking to get her coat off the hook on the wall, beside the door. Soon, she'd be able to admit she was a woman and hang her shawl there, wearing that for walks. For now, she couldn't risk being spotted from the road. He held her coat for her, something no man had done since they'd left New York. It felt awkward, but she thanked him. She wound her braid up atop her head and hid it under her cowboy hat, and with a small wave to her brother, she preceded Wally outside. "It's a beautiful night," she said. The stars were out, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky. It was cold enough they could see their breaths, but Frankie liked the cold. She always had. He walked away from the road and toward the river that the ranch was named after. "How much of the property is yours?" he asked. "Willard and I own all the land to the river. Beyond that is a quarter section that no one has claimed yet. I hope we can eventually expand out to there. There's just mountains there." "What would anyone do with that?" She shrugged. "I don't know, but those mountains are beautiful. They may not be practical, but imagine owning that majestic land." As soon as they were a good distance from the road, he took her hand in his, marveling at how tiny it was. "I know I've said it before, but I can't believe anyone ever believed you were a man. Your hands are so tiny, and your fingers so slender." She shrugged, blushing a bit. "I played the part well. And truly, I've not really left the ranch since we came here. Willard goes to town and talks about his brother, and everything assumes he's telling the truth. A few times men have come here for one reason or another, but they don't look beyond the obvious. Willard calls me his brother, so I must be his brother." She sighed. "Even when we've taken on ranch hands from time to time, and I cooked all the meals, no one ever thought anything of it. They were all blind. Even in your pants, you're the prettiest woman I've ever seen." The words felt foreign on his tongue. He wasn't used to complimenting young ladies, but he needed her to know how he felt. Frankie felt the heat rising to her face. "Thank you." She'd been considered very pretty back home, but she felt like the wind had roughened her skin enough that she'd lost some of her beauty. He led her to a fallen log and sat, pulling her down beside him. He still held her hand clutched in his. "Now that I've finally had a bath and don't smell so bad, what would you think about marrying me?" She looked down at her feet for a moment, feeling overwhelmingly shy. She'd argued with the man at lunch, offered to wash his laundry, and fixed his meals. Now she was shy? "I think I'd like that." He put his arm around her shoulders, wishing they weren't wearing coats. He couldn't even touch her this way. "May I kiss you?" She nodded shyly, turning her head toward him and looking up at him. She was tiny and always had been, while he was huge. Even taller than Willard, who was just about as tall as a church steeple. "I'd like that." His free hand went to her cheek and cupped it tenderly. He lowered his lips to hers and touched them softly with his. The tingling in the pit of her stomach increased, and she wrapped both arms around him, wishing there was less between them. His kiss was nice, and she suddenly wished it could go on forever. When he pulled back, he was a bit out of breath. "How soon can we marry?" "I'll have my dress done by Tuesday morning. We could go to town on Tuesday afternoon and tie the knot." "You're willing to take Weston as your last name?" He nodded. "I wouldn't have come here if I hadn't been. I'll happily give up Miller, because it just means that I was part of the demon horde." She snuggled close to his side. "Good. Then let's make it happen on Tuesday. It will be my first time in town as a woman, but I doubt people will even realize I'm the same person. We can say Willard is my brother, and people won't realize I'm not another sibling." "Is that what you want?" She shrugged. "I'm really not sure. I thought I was brilliant pretending to be a man, but I never considered that the pretense would eventually have to end." He sighed. "Well, either way, that's your decision. Just so people don't think you're a man after we're married. I'll give up my name for you, but I won't get that kind of reputation for you. I won't ask you to. I'll probably still spend most of my time on the homestead." "Does Willard do the shopping?" She nodded. "He always has. It's just easier if I'm not seen." "I see. And you want to keep it that way?" "I guess I never really thought about it. I will though. I'll figure out exactly what I want to do before Tuesday. Does that work for you? Her mind churned. She hated the idea of admitting to the whole town that she'd been lying about her gender for 3 years, but she wanted to be seen as a woman. She loved the idea of going into church on Wally's arm. Do you care which way I go? Yeah, I think I do. I'd rather everyone knew that you'd been pretending to be a man all along. I don't like the idea of deceptions. You're always found out. Trust me on this. She nodded slowly. I promise I'll take your feelings into account as I think about it. Thank you. He leaned down and kissed her once more, needing to convince himself that the first kiss hadn't been a fluke. There was something about this special woman that touched him in a way that no other woman had before. She was meant for him, just as he was meant for her. And their children were meant to be raised on this special ranch in northern Idaho. River's End. It was just as beautiful as the visions the name had created in his mind. She sighed contentedly. We should get back to the house. Willard will come looking for us. Wally shook his head. No, I really don't think he will. He knew I wanted to ask you to marry me tonight. You didn't ask his permission, did you? Though she knew that it was common for a man to ask a father or, in the father's absence, a brother for a woman's hand in marriage, she hated the idea in her case. She'd been on her own for too long, helping make the decisions that guided her own life. She was in charge of her destiny, and no man had the right to say if she could or could not marry. He chuckled. I didn't even think about it. I wouldn't have asked a lady to court me at home without her father's permission. Here I asked a woman to marry me, and it never once occurred to me that I should ask anyone. Is that strange? She shook her head. I'm glad you didn't ask him. He and I are equal partners, and I'd have been angry if he'd said yes or no. It's my place to make those decisions for myself. Are you a suffragette? I don't have a strong opinion on whether or not women should have the right to vote, but I do feel vehemently that women should be in charge of their own lives if they are old enough. And by old enough I mean 17 or older. He nodded slowly. All right. So if, as your husband, I tell you that you need to do something, how will you react? It depends on what you tell me to do. If I think it's a good idea, I'll probably do it with minimal fuss. If you tell me to do something that's against my conscience or just plain stupid, then I won't. I have a brain, and I know how to use it. Wally was surprised by her words, but he had to respect her for them. All right. Thank you for telling me now, and not causing me to be shocked when we marry. Does that mean you're still marrying me? Well, it's not like I didn't know that a woman who would ask her husband to change his name when they married wouldn't have odd ideas about who was in charge in a marriage. You think my ideas are odd? She asked, pulling away from him to look at him by the light of the moon. He shook his head adamantly. That came out wrong. I don't think your ideas are odd so much as revolutionary. I like them though. I will do my best not to order you to do anything. We can decide together. She sighed with relief. Good. And just so you know, if you ever tell me you're putting your foot down over something, I might just have to burn your food for a week straight. Thank you for the warning. I will be sure never to use those particular words with you. She shivered slightly, and he stood. Let's get you back to the house and the warmth of the fire. I'm sorry I didn't realize you were cold. I was enjoying having some time alone with you. Don't apologize. I was enjoying it too. He yawned, covering his mouth quickly with his hand. It must be past 8. He needed to get to bed so he could wake before dawn again. He had to get more sleep. I'm going to walk you to your door, and then go straight back to Willard's to go to sleep. I'm still tired from the train. His arm went around her shoulders and they walked back toward the house. Do you need to sleep late tomorrow? I'm sure Willard would understand. He thought about it briefly before shaking his head. He wasn't going to do that and make a bad impression. There was nothing wrong with him. He was just tired. No, I'll be fine. Are you sure? I can talk to Willard. Absolutely not. I might take a nap tomorrow afternoon, though. After we have our service. What time is that anyway? We usually do our prayer reading right after breakfast. So around 6. Do you want to start going into town to church after we marry? She liked the idea even as she dreaded it. I've always gone to church on Sunday mornings, so it will seem odd to me if I don't. I would like to start going next week if you wouldn't mind too much. We always went back east too. It's just me pretending to be a man that has prevented us from being more a part of the community. It wouldn't surprise me if Willard found himself a girl at church soon if we start going. He was something of a charmer back home. Do you miss New York? He thought she was perfectly content with her life in Idaho, but the last few minutes had been full of references to home. Sometimes. I mean, life was easier there. I wasn't expected to do more than show up at balls in pretty gowns. Out here, I don't know from one day to the next whether I'll be mending fences, chopping down trees, or helping a cow give birth. It's different. I love my life here, but back home it was simple. I was expected to choose a boy to marry and have babies. There was nothing else that I needed to worry about. What about babies? He asked, studying her face by moonlight. Do you want babies? She nodded. I think I'd like to have at least a dozen. He groaned. Just promise me we'll discipline them. We don't need another demon horde. Frankie smiled. I promise you, if people call my children the demon horde, it will be because they are rude, not because my children are. They'd reached her door, and he leaned down to kiss her softly. Dream of me, Francine. She smiled. Are you always going to call me Francine? He nodded. I can't think of you as Frankie. Good. I miss being Francine. She watched him as he walked toward Willard's cabin, smiling slightly. She was going to marry him, and he smelled good now. Chapter 5. By Tuesday, Frankie was nervous. A lot more nervous than she'd thought she'd be. She'd had little time alone with Wally, and she was expected to share her bed with him that night. Really? After lunch, he went back to Willard's cabin to get his things together and change into his wedding clothes, while she did the dishes and changed into her new dress. She wore her hair wound in a crown atop her head, a style she'd loved in her debutante days, but it felt strange now. She carefully smoothed the sides of her dress and stared in the mirror. As a young lady, she'd spent a great deal of time sitting at a vanity table brushing her hair and imagining what her life would be like when she was married and a matron of society. She'd known who she'd marry from a very young age, and she had always done her best to look perfect for him. Then the rumors had started that Reginald, the man of her dreams, had married Catherine Elliott, her worst enemy, and that Catherine was already expecting a baby. Just about the same time, her only brother had been planning to move to Idaho and get some free land. She'd begged him to take her. Finally, after a month of begging, he'd agreed. She couldn't take the ignominy of being tossed aside for someone she hated. That day she'd stopped spending time primping and started to work. She realized that she'd been little more than an empty-headed china doll back then, but now, she was a woman. She was strong and able to do the work of a man, while keeping house and doing the work of a woman. She knew there was nothing she was incapable of. Which was why she'd decided to admit to her charade. When she and Wally stood before the pastor in Weston later, she would admit to her deception and tell him that she was the brother who had come west with Willard. She dreaded it, but she knew it was the right thing to do. Besides, with Wally at her side, she could face them all. She walked into the main room of her little house and opened the door, wondering what was keeping the men. The first thing she saw was Wally, standing there watching her. As soon as he saw her, he removed his hat and held it to his chest. "You look more beautiful than even I dreamed you would, Miss Francine." She blushed prettily. "Thank you, Wally." She felt pretty too. For the first time in ages, she felt absolutely beautiful. For whatever reason, putting on a dress made her feel like she'd been transformed into a lady again. A lady with the memory of how to muck out stalls and mend fences, sure, but a lady nonetheless. He set his carpet bag just inside the door, before offering his hand to help her down the stairs in front of the house. "Willard has the wagon ready to drive us to town." She pulled her shawl over her shoulders as she walked, thinking she should wear a hat, but she didn't care. It was the first time her hair had seen the light of day in 3 years, and she wasn't going to cover it. It was time for her to be a lady, and she was going to flaunt it. Willard smiled at her, nodding slightly. From him it was high praise. Wally helped her into the wagon and got up beside her, covering their laps with a blanket. "That dress is beautiful. I had no idea you knew how to sew." A smile touched her lips. "Willard and I were raised in an affluent household, but our mama believed girls should know how to keep a house. We were taught to cook, sew, clean, knit, crochet. Well, if you can name something a frontier wife should do, we were taught it. I can also waltz perfectly, play piano, and carry a tune." Wally shook his head at her. "How did I end up with such a prize?" She swallowed hard. "When I sent that letter to your sister, I told Willard that if anyone was willing to agree to all my terms, it would be a mail-order miracle. That's what you are to me. My miracle." He smiled. "I like that. I've never been anyone's miracle before. I was usually the one being chased off someone's property because no one trusted me with their daughters, or livestock, for that matter." "Why would they fear for their livestock?" Willard asked. "Well, there was one incident where my siblings and I decided to paint the cow. We took our pa's newspaper and spread it out on the barn floor, and we made Mabel, the cow, stand on it. For some reason, we saw nothing wrong with painting the cow, but we were worried about what would happen if we got paint on the barn floor." Wally shook his head. "The story got around town way too fast for my tastes." Willard blinked a couple of times. "I hope your children don't act like you do." Frankie rolled her eyes. "I can assure you, they won't. My children will be raised with manners, and nowhere in the world is it mannerly to paint a cow. Or throw apples with worms in them at wagons driving by from the top of the apple tree?" Wally asked. She just shook her head. "How long has it been since you stopped considering yourself a member of this demon horde?" Wally thought about it for a moment. He'd probably stopped acting the fool with his siblings when Elizabeth had moved out, so it had been a while. 7 years, I think. When my sister moved out to take over the mail-order bride business, I became one of the oldest left at home, and more responsibilities landed on me. It became more important to help make a living than tie the teacher into the outhouse during lunchtime. Willard snickered. "We talked about doing that a couple of times." "You really did it?" Wally shrugged. "It seemed like the thing to do at the time." "Did you ever put snakes in the teacher's desk?" "Oh yeah. With every new teacher. And we never had a teacher last more than a semester, because of our shenanigans. It was always my brothers and sisters and I pulling the pranks, but the whole class loved the extra recesses they got out of it. Of course, none of them were stuck with the name Demon Horde following them around for the rest of their lives." Frankie smiled at him. "I'm glad you learned to be responsible and came to Idaho. Now I won't worry how people will think about me for pretending to be a man, because I know if we go back to your hometown, people will think even worse of you." "Well, that's not exactly fair," Wally responded, but then he shrugged. "I guess it doesn't really matter though. How often are we going to go all the way back to Beckham?" Frankie shrugged. I don't know. It might be interesting to hear what the people there have to say about you. They stopped in front of the church, and she allowed Wally to help her down. As she walked past him, she whispered, "Exactly what color did you and your siblings decide was right to paint a cow?" "Oh, lavender, of course. You never paint a cow any other hue but lavender." "I mean, really, was there any question?" Frankie was laughing as she walked past him into the church. They found the preacher at the front, practicing his sermon. "Reverend Maddox?" The preacher looked out at them. "What can I help you with?" Frankie walked straight to the preacher, took a deep breath, and said, "I'm not sure if you remember me." "I'm Frankie Weston." The preacher scrunched up his face, obviously thinking. "Of course I remember Frankie Weston, but Frankie's a man. I was just pretending to be a man so I could run around in pants and do a man's work. I'm here to get married. This is my fiancé, Wallace Miller." The old man looked back and forth between Frankie and Wally. "Are you sure you want to marry her? She's been pretending to be a man for an awful long time." Wally smiled at Frankie, taking her hand in his. "I'm sure. I knew she was pretending to be a man from the moment I met her." He didn't mention being a mail-order groom, which pleased Frankie. It was bad enough that she would always have the stigma of pretending to be a man, but she didn't want it to be known she'd sent away for a husband. "Would you mind marrying us, Reverend Maddox?" The Reverend shook his head, looking over at Willard. "You give your permission for this marriage?" Willard crossed his arms and shook his head. "I don't need to. Frankie has been my equal partner since we decided to journey west. She's a lot more capable of choosing a man who will make her happy than I am." The Reverend frowned. "Are you going to give her away?" He shook his head. "There's no need. As I said, it's Frankie's choice." Frankie looked at her brother for a moment before tearing herself away from Wally. She threw herself at Willard, doing her best not to blubber as she hugged him tightly. "You're the best big brother a girl ever had." Willard smiled. "And you're the best little sister, pretending to be a brother. Now go get married." He stood behind Wally and Frankie as they said their vows. When the Reverend told Wally to kiss his bride, she stepped closer, raising her lips to his. The kiss was so much more than a kiss to her. It was a promise for the future. It was the hope of a family being raised on Weston land. It was the miracle Frankie had needed. "I wish you much happiness, Mr. Miller," Reverend Maddox said, once Wally had raised his head. "Oh, I'm taking her name," Wally said with a grin. "Call me Mr. Weston. The three Westons were laughing at the baffled look on the officiant's face as they left the church. "See you on Sunday." When they reached the wagon, Wally held out his hand to help her up. Just as she was gathering her skirts to climb, someone stopped and stared at her. "Francine Weston? Is that you?" Frankie looked over at the sound of the familiar voice, and her heart sank. "Reginald. What are you doing in Idaho?" "Looking for you." "Why?" "You're a married man, and I'm a married woman." She looked at Wally with a smile, not wanting him to think she'd forgotten him. "When did you marry?" Reginald asked, obviously surprised. "About 10 minutes ago." "Wally, this is Reginald White. We knew each other back home." "Reginald, this is my husband Wallace." She didn't give the last name Weston, because she was sure Reginald would make fun of him for taking her last name, and she wouldn't subject her new husband to ridicule. The two men looked at each other, and Willard came around the wagon. "Reginald, you have no business being here. Go home to your wife and child." He stepped between Frankie and Reginald, making it clear the other man had no right to his sister. "They're dead. They both died of the measles. I never loved Catherine anyway, so I came here to find Francine. I guess I'm too late." Reginald shook his head. "That's what you got married in?" I'd have thought a lady like Francine would wear something that was more appropriate to her station in life. Wally nodded. You're very much too late. Goodbye, Reginald. He took Frankie's hand to help her into the wagon, and she accepted it, moving as if in a daze. Once he'd climbed in beside her, Wally stared straight ahead as Willard began the drive back to the ranch. They were halfway home before anyone spoke. Who was that man, Francine? Did you love him? Frankie sighed heavily. I don't know. I don't think so. He was my escort from my debutante ball back in another lifetime. We had talked about marriage, and I was expecting a proposal any day. Then one day, he just stopped coming around. I couldn't figure out what was wrong until I heard that he'd married my archenemy Catherine. She was expecting his baby, so the marriage was forced, but that was the end of that. I asked Willard if I could come west with him that day. Wally frowned. And how did you feel seeing him today? Are those feelings still there? She shook her head immediately. No, not at all. I felt more shock than anything else. I just wanted him to leave, so we could go home. I would choose you over him any day. Wally said nothing more as he watched the scenery go by. He hated that the man had come on his wedding day of all days. He hoped she remembered who she was married to. I'm starving. What's for supper, Frankie? Willard asked, obviously trying to ease the tension. I put a pot roast in before we left. Wally said it was one of his favorite meals, so I thought he should have it on his wedding day. She reached out and wound her fingers through Wally's, hoping he'd understand the gesture was one of apology. Wally sighed. Her brother was going to be there for their wedding supper. Why hadn't he thought of that before? Their situation was odd. Very odd. Maybe he just needed to get used to being part of a family of 3, instead of a couple. He should have known from the letter, shouldn't he? She'd mentioned a brother in it. Who mentioned their brother when they were sending away for a groom? For that matter, who sends away for a groom? The whole situation was odd. Frankie felt horrible. She hadn't asked Reginald to come, but he'd been there anyway. Now what was she supposed to do? It was her wedding night, and her groom was obviously upset with her. Why couldn't life be simple?